Shelby, North Carolina, sits quietly in the folds of the American South. The streets there are long and steady, lined with modest homes and weathered porches. Life in Shelby tends to move in a rhythm that doesn't change much. People go to work, children go to school, Sundays are quiet, and most families know each other, if not by name, then at least by sight. It's the kind of town where people still wave from their cars and church bells still mark time on quiet mornings. In February of 2000, the Degree family lived in a small, neat house on Oakcrest Drive, a residential street tucked away from the main roads. Harold and Aquila Degree had built their life with care and structure. They worked hard. Harold was a dock worker. Aquila held a steady clerical job. They kept their household organized, and they were deeply protective of their two children, a son, O'Brien, and a daughter, Asha. Asha was 9 years old. She was a fourth grader at Falston Elementary School. Most people who knew her described her the same way: shy, polite, and sweet-tempered. She was the kind of child who followed rules carefully. She didn't talk back. She listened when spoken to. She was close with her family, especially with her mother and older brother. She played basketball on a local youth team. She read books often. She loved the color green. At school, Asha kept mostly to herself, but she was known to be a good student. Her teachers noticed she paid attention and worked hard. She wasn't one to seek out the spotlight. She liked order. She liked knowing what to expect. In the classroom and at home, her behavior was described as consistent, grounded, and reliable. The Degree household didn't have a computer at the time. Internet access was limited. The family didn't use credit cards. They kept things simple, and they liked it that way. The parents were careful about who their children spent time with. Asha and her brother had a bedtime routine. They didn't stray from it. Their television use was monitored. Most evenings were predictable: dinner, homework, maybe a game or two, and then bed. Their neighborhood was calm. It wasn't rural, but it had space, lawns, fences, streetlights. There was very little crime. Families stayed where they were. Children walked to and from school together. On weekends, it was common to hear kids outside riding bikes, playing basketball, or simply running between yards. On school nights, the windows were usually dark by 10. In this setting, there was nothing unusual about Asha Degree. No warnings, no conflict, no sense that anything was about to change. The early weeks of February 2000 had been normal. Asha went to school. She played basketball. She did her homework. Her team had lost a game on the 12th, and she had been upset about it, disappointed in herself for fouling out, but her parents had comforted her. They talked about how she always tried her best, and that it was just a game. That night passed like any other. The next day was a Sunday. The Degree family went to church in the morning. They spent time with relatives that afternoon. Asha and her brother did their homework in the evening. The power had gone out briefly due to a storm, but it had come back before bedtime. Nothing out of the ordinary. That night, around 8 p.m., Asha and O'Brien went to bed. Their shared bedroom was small but tidy. They had their own beds, posters on the wall, books nearby. They fell asleep the way they always did, side by side, in the home they had never left unattended, in the only place they had ever truly known. What no one knew then was that this would be the last night Asha Degree was ever seen inside her home. And no one, not her parents, not her teachers, not the investigators who would spend years trying to understand what happened, could ever explain why a child so protected, so careful, so deeply rooted in her daily life, would choose to walk away into the night. The days leading up to Asha Degree's disappearance did not carry any visible change. They unfolded like the weeks before them, routine, familiar, and quietly structured within the life of her family. At school, Asha had remained focused. She was punctual with her assignments. Teachers recalled no outbursts, no signs of confusion or distress. She was still the same quiet, reserved girl they had always known. She kept mostly to herself, as she usually did, but not in a way that raised concern. Her shyness was simply part of who she was. On Friday, February 11th, Asha attended school like normal. She came home that afternoon and prepared for a basketball game the next day. She was part of a local girls' team, the Yellow Jackets. That Saturday morning, she suited up for a game against another school's team. During the match, she fouled out. It wasn't the first time, but it upset her. Witnesses said she was visibly frustrated. She sat on the bench quietly, her arms folded, not speaking much to anyone after the final whistle. After the game, her parents tried to reassure her. They reminded her that she had done well and that the game was already over. Her mood seemed to soften. Later that afternoon, she went with her family to a relative's house to spend time together. That evening, back at home, things felt normal again. On Sunday, February 13th, the Degree family went to church. They sat together in the pews, as they always did. Afterward, Asha and her brother spent the afternoon at home doing homework. It was a rainy day. A storm was moving through Cleveland County, bringing heavy wind and brief power outages across the area. That evening, the lights flickered, then went out entirely for a short while. The outage didn't last long. When the lights returned, the children got ready for bed. Asha took a bath. She put on her pajamas. She and her brother, O'Brien, were in bed by around 8 p.m. Their room was quiet. 2 beds, posters of basketball players on the walls, school books stacked on a small shelf, their backpacks packed for the next morning, waiting by the door. Nothing in those final hours suggested anything out of the ordinary. Asha had not been in trouble. She had not seemed frightened or distant. She had no history of running away, no access to transportation, no outside influences that her parents were aware of. Around 9 p.m., Harold Degree came home from his second job. He checked on the children. They were both asleep. Aquila went to bed shortly after, around 11:30 p.m. She also checked on the kids. Still asleep. There were no strange noises in the house that night. No phone calls. No visitors. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows. Rain continued to fall in sheets. And sometime in the hours between midnight and dawn, Asha Degree woke up, quietly got out of bed, and left the house. No one saw her leave. No doors were left open. No windows broken. Nothing taken. Her bed was empty, and she was gone. By early morning on February 14th, 2000, the Degree household had begun to stir. It was a Monday, and like every school day, there was a pattern to how things unfolded. Aquila Degree got up just after 5:30 a.m., expecting to start her routine and get the children ready for school. She moved through the house as she always did, quietly, without rush. When she stepped into the children's room, she noticed something that didn't make sense. O'Brien was asleep in his bed, but Asha's was empty. At first, there was no panic. Aquila assumed Asha might be in the bathroom. She walked down the hall and checked. It was empty. Then she searched the rest of the house, calling her name softly at first, then louder. The closet was open, the kitchen dark. The front and back doors were still closed. But Asha wasn't in the house. She woke Harold. The two of them searched every room, every corner. Then they stepped outside. It was cold. Wet leaves covered the ground. The street was still dark and quiet. There was no sign of her. They got in the car and drove the immediate area. Nothing. A few neighbors had lights on, but no one had seen anything. She wasn't at a friend's house. She wasn't walking nearby. And there was no sign of forced entry. By 6:30 a.m., they called the police. The responding officer arrived quickly. The Degrees neighborhood was not a place where children went missing. Most homes were occupied by long-standing residents. The area was known to be safe, especially for families with young children. The idea that a 9-year-old girl had simply walked away from her home in the middle of the night, during a storm, did not make sense to anyone. More officers arrived. They checked the perimeter of the house. There were no signs of forced entry and no footprints that could be traced through the wet ground. A few items from Asha's room were missing. Her backpack was gone, along with a few clothes and some personal belongings, but nothing of value had been taken. The home hadn't been disturbed. It appeared she had packed the items herself. That same morning, a missing child alert was issued. Search teams began to comb the surrounding blocks. Canvassers knocked on doors. Flyers were printed before noon. Neighbors gathered to help. Volunteers walked through nearby fields and drainage ditches, checked under porches and behind garages. The local fire department joined. Drones and tracking dogs were not yet widely used in 2000, but officers on foot and horseback covered every inch of the neighborhood they could access. They found nothing. Then a man came forward. A motorist driving south on Highway 18 reported seeing a small figure walking along the roadside around 4 a.m. that morning, just over an hour before Asha's mother noticed she was missing. It had been dark and raining heavily. The figure appeared to be a child. The driver assumed it was someone whose parents would be nearby and did not stop. A second witness later confirmed a similar sighting. A small girl, walking alone on the shoulder of the highway, wearing light-colored clothing, carrying what looked like a backpack. It was miles from the Degree home. Search teams were redirected toward Highway 18. The area was bordered by thick woods, scattered homes, and stretches of roadside with deep drainage ditches. In daylight, it was difficult enough to walk along. At night, in a storm, it would have been nearly impossible to navigate safely. And yet, if those sightings were accurate, Asha had covered several miles on foot in the middle of the night, during severe weather, and without alerting anyone along the way. There were no footprints left to follow. The rain had washed away most physical traces by morning. Tracking dogs were brought to the location, but they were unable to pick up a trail strong enough to pursue. Investigators were now faced with a scenario that challenged everything they understood about missing children cases. Asha had not been abducted from her bedroom. There was no broken lock, no signs of someone entering the home. She had taken her school backpack, packed some belongings, and walked away on her own. But she was 9 years old. She had never done anything like this before. She didn't have access to the internet. She didn't speak of running away. She had no history of mental health problems. She hadn't been bullied. She had gone to school on Friday, played a basketball game on Saturday, gone to church on Sunday, and gone to bed in the home she had always known. No one could understand what had changed. As the hours passed on February 14th, the search for Asha Degree began to shift from neighborhood effort to community-wide mobilization. By mid-morning, word had spread across Cleveland County that a 9-year-old girl had vanished from her home sometime during the early hours of the day. People came without being asked. Teachers, church members, neighbors, parents. They parked their cars along roadside shoulders, left their own children in trusted care, and joined the effort to find her. The sheriff's office quickly established a command center. From that point forward, the search was organized in grids. Volunteers were assigned to walk the wooded areas along Highway 18, the field edges, and the drainage ditches that snaked between properties. Search teams were instructed to call out gently as they moved. Her name, the word home, and the same phrases Asha's parents would have used. They hoped she had found shelter nearby, that she was cold and scared but alive. But no one called back. Searchers pushed further outward, through briar, mud, and shoulder-high brush. They looked beneath sheds, along tree lines, and behind every abandoned vehicle and small structure. A helicopter was brought in to scan the area from above. In the woods, search dogs tried to trace scent from the last confirmed sighting. They followed a path for a while along the shoulder of the road, but then it ended abruptly, at a point just past a crossroad. Some believed that might be where Asha had entered a vehicle. Whether she did so willingly or not was impossible to know. No car had been reported in the area at the time. No witnesses came forward saying they had seen her get into one. There were no tire tracks distinct enough to lead anywhere. On the second day, the FBI joined the investigation. By then, the Degree home had been carefully examined. Investigators found no signs of forced entry. No footprints inside the house. No objects moved or disturbed. Her school backpack was missing, along with some clothing and her basketball uniform. A few personal items were gone, but there were no signs of panic in the way things had been packed. Her bed had been left neatly. It looked as though she had left with intention. That didn't sit easily with anyone, because Asha had never expressed any desire to run away. There had been no arguments in the home, no disruptions at school. Her mother had just done her hair for Valentine's Day, small ponytails tied with red ribbons. There had been candy bags prepared for her class. Nothing about the previous day pointed to fear, pressure, or impulsive behavior. Detectives asked about the storm, the wind, the rain, the lightning that had rolled through the area overnight. They spoke with utility crews and road maintenance workers. No one had seen anything. No one had come across a child walking alone. But the sightings on Highway 18, though brief, remained credible. At least 2 people had seen her walking that morning. That meant she had likely covered multiple miles on foot, in the dark, in wet shoes, without being noticed. The Degree family remained at the center of the search, not just emotionally, but physically. They stood with volunteers. They spoke to the media, carefully, without emotion taking over. They repeated what they knew, what they didn't, what they hoped. Aquila said she had no idea why her daughter would leave. Harold said it didn't make sense. None of it did. They held hands during interviews. They stood beside the sheriff. They never once lost focus. Each night, they went home without answers. They left the porch light on. Flyers began to appear across town. They were placed in windows, pinned to community boards, tucked into church bulletins. A photograph of Asha stared back, soft eyes, hair neatly pulled back, quiet confidence in her posture. She was young, too young to be alone, too young to leave on her own, too young to stay gone this long. By the end of the week, hundreds of volunteers had taken part in the search. Law enforcement had walked more than 20 miles of forest, field, and roadside. A few items were found: a pencil, a candy wrapper, a mitten, but none could be definitively connected to her. At a press conference, one investigator said plainly, "We are looking for a child who has walked away from the only place she's ever known, in a storm, with no light and no direction. And we don't know why." Theories began to form, but no one had enough evidence to settle on anything. As Valentine's Day passed, and the days grew warmer, the case began to take on a different tone. Not an active rescue, but a longer search. The kind of search where answers didn't come quickly, where the most likely possibilities began to feel more distant. And all the while, the Degree home stayed quiet. Her room was untouched. Her things remained where they had always been. Her parents kept answering the door, kept giving interviews, kept looking for any sign that their daughter had not simply vanished. Because she was not the kind of child who would leave, and nothing in the days before had given them reason to believe she ever would. By the end of the first week, there was a shift. The urgency didn't fade, but the tone changed. At first, the search for Asha Degree had carried the weight of expectation. That she might be found hiding in a shed, that she might have followed an animal into the woods, that she might emerge from somewhere frightened and cold, but alive, that someone somewhere would come forward and say they had taken her in, not realizing the depth of the search underway. But that moment never came. The days grew longer. More volunteers arrived. More ground was covered, and still no sign of her. Local officers, state agents, and the FBI worked side by side, but the absence of evidence began to feel heavier than any single discovery might have. No clothing had been found. No new items of hers had surfaced. No one credible came forward to say they had seen her after that last reported sighting on Highway 18. That road, narrow and unlit, now served as the last fixed point in the case. The stretch where she was seen walking in the rain, alone, steady, not running, remained etched in the minds of everyone involved. There had been nothing frantic about it, nothing to suggest she was fleeing. The people who had seen her said she didn't seem lost. She seemed purposeful, like she had somewhere she believed she was going. But she had told no one, and wherever she was headed, she had never arrived. The Degree family continued to speak to media. They appeared on local stations, then on national platforms. They joined law enforcement at each update. They attended prayer vigils and community meetings. But they never tried to shape the story. They didn't assign blame. They didn't speculate. They simply repeated the truth. Their daughter had disappeared, and they needed help bringing her home. Investigators began to widen the lens. They asked questions of everyone in Asha's life: her teachers, her classmates, her coaches. They interviewed relatives, neighbors, and co-workers. They looked into mail routes, school bus stops, and local delivery schedules. No one stood out. There were no suspects. No one had behaved strangely in the days prior to her disappearance. No one had taken sudden leave or fled town. They searched her school records. No issues. No disciplinary history. Her behavior had remained consistent. She was still the same quiet, polite child who turned in her homework and sat in the front row. Her teachers were stunned. Detectives also went through her notebooks and drawings at home. They found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of anxiety. No talk of plans. No journal entries that hinted at distress or secrecy. Just the usual sketches of animals, lists of favorite colors, small notes written in neat handwriting. She had even packed Valentine's candy for her class the night before she disappeared. She had planned to give it out at school. There was no reason, none at all, for her to leave. And that was what made everything so difficult. The public theories began to swirl. Some thought she might have been groomed by someone older, maybe someone she'd met at school, or at church or in passing. But the Degree family didn't have a computer. They monitored phone use closely. Asha didn't walk to school alone. There was no evidence she had been in contact with anyone unknown. Others suggested she had been kidnapped, that she might have left voluntarily but been intercepted, or that someone had lured her out of the house in the first place. But there was no trace of communication. No notes, no signs of a plan. And her parents were clear. She hadn't shown any indication of fear or pressure in the days before. Then there were quieter suggestions. That maybe she had left to prove something. That maybe she had been frightened by something small, a failing grade, a disagreement with a teammate, and that the weight of childhood worry had pushed her to step out into the dark. But if that were true, where was she? And why had no one come forward in all the days that had followed? The case stayed active. The search continued. Billboards were erected along highways. Flyers were mailed across the region. Truckers were given her photograph. Interviews aired across multiple states. Her story was shared in churches, on school bulletin boards, and in weekly neighborhood newsletters. The FBI provided logistical support. Search teams revisited old areas. Ditches were rechecked. Empty buildings were entered a second and third time. And still nothing. As the second week came and went, the Degree family began to prepare for something harder than waiting. The idea that this might not be resolved quickly, that their daughter might not return in the way they had first imagined, that the search might become a long one. But they did not stop. They held on, quietly but clearly, to the belief that she had not simply vanished, that someone somewhere knew something, and they were willing to wait for as long as it took to bring her home. In the weeks that followed Asha Degree's disappearance, the tempo of the search shifted once again. The urgency remained, but it now moved with a steadier rhythm. The high alert of the early days gave way to long-term procedures. Updates filed, interviews revisited, and tips sorted as they came in, most of them quietly, without fanfare. Each day, investigators returned to the same question. How could a child so young, so closely watched, so sheltered in her daily life, walk out of her home in the middle of the night and disappear without a single witness beyond the 2 brief highway sightings? There had been no credible ransom notes, no confirmed abductions in the area, no new leads to indicate she was being held somewhere. There were phone calls, letters, the kind that come in any missing persons case, some from people who thought they'd seen her, others from those looking to insert themselves into the story. Most turned out to be false, unhelpful, or intentionally misleading. Still, every one of them was followed up. No detail was too small. Nothing was dismissed without review. Spring turned to summer. The billboards remained up. Her school held moments of silence. Her friends advanced to the next grade. And Asha's desk stayed empty. There were no new discoveries. And then, 10 months after she disappeared, something was found. It was August 2001, nearly a full year later, when a contractor working on a construction project made a quiet report to the police. He had been clearing land off Highway 18, not far from the town of Morganton, about 30 miles north of Shelby, the opposite direction from where Asha had last been seen walking. As he dug near the edge of a wooded area, he uncovered a plastic bag buried in the soil. Inside it was a backpack. It was worn but intact. weathered from time and exposure, but still sealed. And inside the backpack were items that unmistakably belonged to Asha. Clothing, school supplies, personal items, everything confirmed by her family. The bag was not placed on the surface. It had been buried deliberately, wrapped in another bag to preserve it, and hidden in a spot unlikely to be found by accident. There was no indication of how long it had been there, no trace evidence left behind, no DNA that led to a suspect. What investigators had hoped would provide clarity only deepened the questions. Why was it so far from her last confirmed location? Why had it been buried? Why was it in Morganton, an area she had never visited, had no ties to, and no reason to approach? And how had someone placed it there without anyone noticing? That discovery marked a turning point in the case. For the first time since Asha's disappearance, investigators had a physical object that had traveled with her, something that had made it past that night. It meant she had survived, at least for a while. It meant someone else had likely been involved. But it also raised new doubts. Until that point, most of the investigation had focused on areas near the Degree home, particularly the stretch of Highway 18, where she had been seen walking. But now it seemed possible she had been moved, or had gone, much farther than anyone had realized. Morganton was not close, not a walkable distance for a child, not a place a 9-year-old could reach on her own without transportation, which meant that at some point she had likely entered a vehicle. Whether by choice or by force was still unclear, but it meant she had not vanished alone. And whoever had buried that backpack had done so carefully, without rushing, in a location only someone familiar with the area might think to use. Despite the significance of the find, it did not lead to any suspects. No further items were discovered nearby. The surrounding land was searched carefully, both by hand and with equipment. Dogs were brought in. Soil was tested. But no human remains, no articles of clothing, no evidence of a crime scene emerged. The backpack stood alone, a single, silent object, removed from where she had disappeared, disconnected from any witness, and giving away nothing about what had happened between that stormy night and the day it was buried. For the Degree family, the discovery was devastating, not because it offered closure, but because it reopened the wound in a new and painful way. For nearly a year, they had hoped Asha had simply gotten lost, or had run away and would eventually come home. The finding of her belongings, hidden in a place she had never been, changed the shape of that hope. It didn't confirm anything, but it made clear that something had happened. Something that had not been accidental. Something that had involved someone else. And yet again, there were no answers. Only a bag underground, and the quiet realization that the search was now something else entirely. As the second year passed without resolution, the case of Asha Degree moved into a different category. No longer just an open investigation, but one that had begun to rest in that difficult space between active search and quiet endurance. It was no longer in the spotlight every week, but it was not forgotten. Not by her family, not by her town, and certainly not by the investigators who had carried her photo in their files every day since the morning she disappeared. The backpack had offered hope, a breakthrough, a thread, but it had also introduced more uncertainty than it resolved. Forensic testing had revealed no identifiable fingerprints, no hair, no fibers from another person. The plastic bags used to wrap the backpack were common. The location where it had been buried was quiet and remote, but not suspicious enough on its own to suggest a known criminal pattern. No nearby residents recalled anything strange in the months after her disappearance. There were no further objects found in that area. Nothing else buried. Nothing nearby. Just that one deliberate act, digging, wrapping, hiding, and then silence. After that, the case entered what many in law enforcement refer to as the long stretch. The years where answers don't arrive in clusters, where you no longer expect daily developments, and where leads slow down to a drip. But it did not stop. Every few months, tips still came in, some from people who claimed to have seen Asha in public places, a store, a bus stop, a small town hours away. Others came from prison inmates who wanted to talk in exchange for favors or attention. Most turned out to be false. A few were simply misunderstood identities. A few others were too vague to confirm or disprove. Each one was documented, followed up, and filed. None of them led to her. The FBI continued to support the case over the years, maintaining Asha's profile in their missing persons system and releasing updated age progression photos at regular intervals. These images, digital renderings of how Asha might look at age 12, 15, 17, were never perfect, but they kept the case visible. Every time a new image was released, local news outlets would run a brief update. The photo would appear in a corner of the evening broadcast. Reporters would quietly repeat the timeline, and somewhere in Cleveland County, a family would sit at home and watch. Her parents never missed those updates. They aged slowly and visibly while their daughter remained the same. Her real face frozen in time, her digital likeness growing older each year, like a shadow walking just beyond reach. Over time, a few things became clearer. There had been no indication in Asha's life, in the months before her disappearance, that she was preparing to leave. She had no phone of her own, no access to the internet. Her school life had been stable. There were no signs of abuse in the home, no family conflict, no bullying reported at school, no mental health history, no diary entries that hinted at trouble. She had packed a few of her belongings, but not in a way that suggested planning. There was no map, no notebook, no change of clothes beyond what she wore. Just small personal items like any child might choose, things that made her feel safe. It still wasn't known what had prompted her to leave. There were theories, quiet ones, passed from investigator to investigator. Maybe she'd read something that sparked a sense of adventure. Maybe she had a misunderstanding with someone at school and thought she was in trouble. Maybe someone had spoken to her from outside the home, someone she thought she could trust. But none of those theories could be confirmed. And so, year by year, the case moved quietly. It remained open, but it remained still. For her family, this became the shape of life. Not an ending, not an answer, but a space where a child was missing, and no one could say why. They kept her room. They kept her things. They kept telling her story. And they kept waiting. In the years that followed, the search for Asha Degree never officially stopped. It slowed, yes. It stretched. But it never truly ended. Her case remained open, active in the background, even when the headlines faded and the days between updates grew longer. For her family, and for the investigators still assigned to the file, that meant the work became quieter, but no less important. One of the strengths of the Degree case from the beginning was that it had never been shelved or passed over. The Cleveland County Sheriff's Office kept it active. The FBI remained involved. And each time a new lead came in, even years later, it was evaluated, reviewed, followed, even if it led nowhere. There were moments when the case stirred again, moments when the silence was broken, if only briefly. In 2015, 15 years after Asha vanished, the FBI and local authorities launched a renewed campaign. They hoped that advances in forensic technology, digital analysis, and national media reach might uncover something that had been missed. They re-released details of the case, updated the age progression images again, and began to revisit old tips with fresh eyes. And then something unexpected surfaced. A witness came forward, someone who hadn't spoken publicly during the initial search. He described seeing a girl matching Asha's description in the early morning hours of February 14, 2000. She was walking along the roadside, as previous reports had already confirmed. But he remembered something specific. He claimed he saw a dark-colored car pull over near her. A child, he said, appeared to approach the vehicle. Then the car drove away. It wasn't conclusive. It didn't name anyone. It didn't come with a license plate or a make and model. But it was more detail than they had before. Investigators treated it seriously. They issued new public statements. They appealed to anyone who had driven through that stretch in the early morning hours of Valentine's Day, especially those who had passed by near the Highway 18 corridor between Shelby and Morganton. They asked for memories, for photos, for stories, but time had passed, and if someone had seen something, they no longer came forward. Another moment came in 2020, on the 20th anniversary of her disappearance. That year, the FBI released a public update, one that included a renewed appeal for information and a new set of items of interest. Specifically, they asked the public for help identifying two things. The first was a Dr. Seuss book, McKelligott's Pool. The second was a children's t-shirt featuring a picture of the band New Kids on the Block. Both items, they said, may have been in Asha's possession at the time she went missing. Both may have played a role in understanding who she came into contact with. Neither item had been part of the original belongings reported missing from her room. That raised questions. Had she obtained those things after leaving home? Had someone given them to her? Were they planted or carried with her, unknown to her parents? Or had she been exposed to them in the time after her disappearance? The FBI didn't clarify, but their release suggested that, even after 2 decades, there were still details being uncovered, still pieces to the puzzle that hadn't been shared with the public before. Once again, the family participated in interviews. They stood in front of microphones. They asked for help, and they reminded everyone that this was not a cold case. This was their daughter, and she was still missing. By now, Asha Degree's name had become known well beyond North Carolina. Her photo had appeared on television, in newspapers, on billboards, and online databases. She had been profiled on national shows. She was included on the FBI's official missing child list. And each time a new child disappeared under unexplained circumstances, her case was quietly compared to theirs. But no connections ever held. There were no patterns, no links to other missing persons, no person of interest ever officially named. Just a child who walked into the night, whose backpack was found buried, and whose case refused to close. Still, those working the investigation continued to review every piece. Case files had grown into boxes. Maps had been marked and remarked. Witness interviews retaken. Technology changed the way digital records were searched, but the core of the investigation remained grounded in the same few truths they had always known. The home had been quiet. The storm had been real, and Asha had walked out without telling anyone why. As time moved on, and the years began to pass in quiet intervals, the emotional center of Asha Degree's disappearance never shifted far from her family. They had lived every stage of the search, the early chaos, the waves of hope, the long silence. But what they lived with most was the inescapable absence, the quiet echo of someone who had once filled every corner of the home and was now simply not there. Grief, when it has no explanation, behaves differently. It doesn't build to a peak or soften into memory. It lingers in the air. It waits in the mornings. It returns at night. And for Harold and Aquila Degree, the uncertainty of what had happened to their daughter never left the front of their minds. Each birthday, each holiday, each start of a new school year passed with the same thought. What would she be doing now? In public, they remained composed. They continued to participate in every effort made on her behalf. They joined awareness events, allowed their home to serve as the backdrop for interviews, and held their ground with quiet strength whenever asked to describe the last night they saw her. They didn't speak in speculation. They spoke in facts, and they repeated the same truth year after year, that they believed their daughter was taken, and that they were still waiting for her return. The community, too, had changed under the weight of the case. Shelby had grown in small ways. The roads were busier, the neighborhoods larger. But Asha's name remained. People remembered her, not only because she had been a local child, but because her story never resolved. It stayed in the background of conversation. Her photo was still visible in churches and convenience stores, especially during the winter months. The February air brought her memory back with a particular kind of clarity. For the people who had been part of the original search, those who had walked the woods, knocked on doors, handed out flyers, there was a shared, unspoken understanding that they had been part of something rare, something that had never made sense, and something that had never really ended. One of the deputies who had been among the first to arrive at the Degree house later said it plainly. He had worked dozens of cases, but this one was different, because the evidence didn't lead anywhere, because every theory broke down eventually, And because Asha's story had no clear moment where things turned wrong, it simply drifted into mystery. The home on Oakcrest Drive remained quiet. Her room was preserved not as a shrine, but as something softer, a space waiting, not giving up. Her school books stayed on the shelf. Her basketball trophy remained in place. Her mother said she kept Asha's belongings just as they were, because she had nothing new to replace them with. There had been no updates, no returned items, no new memories to add, so they kept the ones they had. When people asked if the family still believed she was alive, the answer never changed. Yes, because there had never been proof otherwise. Because parents know what kind of children they raise. And because in the absence of anything final, hope becomes something you learn to live with. Not hope in the loud sense, not false reassurance, just the steady, quiet belief that their daughter's story wasn't finished. By now, Asha Degree would be an adult, but the world still remembers her as the girl she was. 9 years old, with deep eyes, a steady expression, and a quiet way of carrying herself. She had not left behind a diary, a plan, or a farewell. She had left behind a family, a backpack buried far from home, and a series of questions that still had no answers. And even so, those who knew her never stopped seeing her as someone who could come back. Because the door had never been closed. Because no one had seen her leave it behind. And because sometimes, even without evidence, memory stays sharp, especially when the silence never broke. The name Asha Degree never left the public entirely. In the years since her disappearance, it became part of a small but significant collection of stories. Cases where a child left no trace, where the ordinary turned unexplainable, and where time continued forward without answers. In North Carolina, her name still draws quiet recognition. Across the country, it still appears in articles, on forums, and in quiet conversations among those who follow missing persons cases closely. But what stands out most is not just how long the case has remained open. It's how gently people speak about it. Because Asha was not known for controversy. Her family did not push theories into the public. Her story did not contain scandal, nor did it ask for attention beyond what was necessary to keep her remembered. She became a symbol not of crime, but of silence. A case defined not by suspects or suspects' names, but by the steady shape of absence. Every few years, local law enforcement reaffirms that her case is still active. The FBI continues to list her as a missing person. And with each anniversary, February 14th, the day she disappeared, media outlets quietly update their readers. They print her photo, now accompanied by age-progressed versions. Images that show her as she might look at 16, or 20, or even 25. And yet, even as the technology changes her face with each release, the original photo remains the one most people recognize. The small school portrait, braids tied with white beads, a faint smile, the look of a child not yet shaped by worry. That image never left. It appears on missing posters. It is shared on social media. It's printed on flyers that still get taped to windows, passed out at church events, handed to truck drivers at rest stops. Every now and then, someone calls in a tip because they've seen someone who resembles that picture. And every time, investigators check it, even when they know it's unlikely, even when nothing has changed. In communities across the country, Asha's story became something people shared quietly. In church groups, among teachers, in conversations with parents, not as a warning, but as a reminder that even in the most structured homes, even with loving families and close-knit neighborhoods, uncertainty can slip in without sound. Her case is often used in training sessions for law enforcement, less as an example of failure and more as an example of complexity, of how unpredictable behavior can be, especially in children, of how much we don't always see, even when we believe we understand. The Degree family never stopped participating. They spoke at events when asked. They offered words of support to other families of missing children. They kept her story alive without ever trying to control how others told it. Their message was always the same: Asha was still missing. She was still loved, and they were still here waiting. In 2020, a scholarship was created in Asha's name. It was given to local students who showed dedication, focus, and kindness, the same qualities people remembered in her. It was not a large award, not something promoted widely, but it was a way to carry her name forward in something active, something good. A way to create presence in the space where there had only been absence. Over the years, people who never knew her began to speak about her as if they had. Online communities formed. Writers revisited her case with care. Documentaries quietly mentioned her name, not in sensational tones, but in the way someone might describe a memory they haven't let go of. Because that's what her case had become, a memory that didn't belong to just one family anymore, but to anyone who had ever wondered how a child could walk into the dark and never be seen again. When enough time passes without answers, absence takes on its own kind of presence. It moves into daily life, not as a loud reminder, but as something steady and quiet. It shows up in routines, in the way a door is still locked at night, in the way a light is left on, just in case. That's how Asha Degree remained with her family, not frozen in time, but quietly woven into it. The home on Oakcrest Drive changed in small ways over the years. Rooms shifted, life moved forward, but Asha's space was never fully altered. Her parents held on to her things, not because they couldn't let go, but because letting go would mean accepting something they were never given the chance to understand. The evidence never allowed them that. No confession, no final trace, just a child who stepped out into the rain and didn't return. For Aquila and Harold Degree, grief became part of how they lived, not something that ever passed. They went back to work. They kept the house running. They made space for birthdays, holidays, and the ordinary rhythms of everyday life. But the weight of not knowing stayed with them. They didn't speak about it often unless asked. But they never stopped thinking about her. People in the community respected that silence. Over the years, it became clear that the Degree family didn't need reminders or condolences. They needed patience. And they got it. Friends didn't push for updates. Neighbors didn't offer empty comfort. They simply stayed close in small ways, with gestures, with presence, and with the understanding that the story wasn't over. At church, where the Degree family had long been active, Asha's name remained part of the prayer list. Even when newer events pushed their way to the front of people's attention, her name still held a place. Not because people believed she might walk in through the doors one Sunday, but because remembrance had become a way of honoring her. A form of stillness, practiced week after week. Sometimes, visitors who didn't know the story would ask why the congregation still mentioned a child who had gone missing so long ago. The answer was simple. Because no one had said otherwise. Because the door hadn't closed. Because she was still part of them. Investigators continued to work the case in slow, careful turns. Every few years, new detectives would step in, reviewing files, comparing notes, asking questions already asked. Most of the work had been done. Most of the tips had been checked. But still, the case remained open, not just symbolically, but functionally. Asha Degree's file wasn't shelved. Her photo wasn't stored away. She was still, officially, a missing person. And that designation meant something. Even 2 decades later, the FBI and Cleveland County authorities would confirm it. Asha's case was still active. Her name was still being checked against new data. Her belongings were still held in evidence. Her disappearance was still reviewed. And the question remained the same as it had been on that first morning in February. Where did she go? For families of missing children, time becomes a strange thing. There's no defined beginning or end to the waiting. Every year passes in full, but always with something left open. Anniversaries are marked, but never celebrated. Holidays are honored, but never quite complete. And hope, when it stays long enough, becomes a quiet ritual. Not loud or desperate, but steady. A belief you carry not because it always feels possible, but because it's the only way to keep going. That's the space the Degree family learned to live in. One where Asha was still theirs, even when the world around them moved on. Some stories never leave, not because they are retold loudly or constantly, but because they settle into the quiet corners of people's lives. The disappearance of Asha Degree became one of those stories, soft in tone, steady in weight, and never fully gone. Her face remains familiar, not from fame but from memory. She's the child who walked out of her home in the early hours of Valentine's Day, 2000. She carried a small backpack, packed a few of her things, and walked into a storm. For reasons no one has ever clearly understood, she left behind her home, her family, and everything she knew. And she never returned. More than 20 years have passed. The world has changed. People who were children when she vanished have grown up, become parents themselves, and now speak of her case as something they remember from the background of their own childhoods. A teacher who once called her name for attendance now calls other names. Friends who once sat next to her in class now bring their own children to that same school. But Asha's name never truly faded. It's spoken gently, written carefully, remembered without exaggeration, because her story doesn't need anything added to it. It remains powerful in its stillness. For her family, the waiting became life. It changed shape over time, but it never ended. They learned to move forward without moving on. Each year, they held a walk in her honor, a slow, quiet event to raise awareness, retrace her last known steps, and remind the community that she was still missing. People came, not out of curiosity, but out of care. They walked alongside the family, not asking for anything, just being there. That kind of presence mattered more than words. Inside the Degree home, her things were kept not as artifacts, but as parts of a life that had not been erased. Her room remained, and her voice, though not heard, was still felt in the house. Her parents didn't try to preserve the past in a perfect way. They simply made room for her in the present, in the way they spoke, in the way they remembered, and in the way they waited. They never called the case solved. They never used the word closure. They used her name, and they waited. In missing persons cases, there is often a point where the story begins to dim, where updates stop, and time becomes the only thing still moving. But Asha's story stayed visible, not because of constant developments, but because of the way it stayed unresolved. There was no final page, no confirmed sighting, no conclusion, just a girl who walked into the dark, and a family who never stopped believing that someone, somewhere, knew what happened after she left the road. The quiet that follows a disappearance is unlike any other silence. It isn't just the absence of sound. It's the weight of every possibility left open. That silence has followed Asha's name for more than 2 decades. And it remains. But so does the light her family left on.